Welcome to the Old Convent. This is going to be the first of other events that we'll put on here. We also run a 2-week bi-weekly social over here for those that might be interested if you talk to someone about that. But before I introduce the speaker, I'd just like to say a big thank you to the team that got this together, that promoted it, put it together, carried all these chairs up these stairs, and I've got everything together. It's Jane over here and a team of about a dozen people that all helped out. So I won't keep you waiting any longer to introduce Mark Devlin. It's the first time he's been speaking in Stroud. He's currently on tour promoting his new book, Musical Truth, Volume 3. And I know we're all keen to hear what he has to say, so I'll hand the mic over to Mark.
Well, thanks very much. So it is my first time speaking in Stroud, and if I'd been this successful back in the day when I was a DJ, it could all have turned out very different. So how's the Jubilee weekend for everyone? Enjoying it? You've been celebrating her travesty? Very nice of COVID to recede just in time for the Jubilee weekend, though. Very lucky timing. So I'm going to be presenting some excerpts from the new book, Musical Truth Volume 3. We're going to be doing this in 2 parts, so the first part is going to be slightly longer than the second, I suspect. It's actually the first time I've presented this particular format at a live talk, so it's a bit of a road test. But I think the first part is going to be slightly more than an hour. Then we'll take a quick break of maybe 20 minutes or so, and then come back for part 2, which will be around 50 minutes. So these talks reinforce many of the points that I've put across in the 3 volumes of my Musical Truth books. And the overriding theme is that the corporate-controlled music industry is nothing like we've been led to believe it is. So we're conditioned into thinking that the music industry is all about harmless fun and entertainment, right? And that's what it should be. But unfortunately, when you do a deep dive into the true nature of this institution and pretty much every other institution in our daily lives, when it comes to it, you discover that it's run by some very different people and groups and organisations to what we think it is. And when it comes to music and entertainment generally, you wouldn't really expect to find aspects of dark, occult, ritualistic activity, Satanism, Luciferianism, that kind of thing. Would you? I wouldn't. Well, if you've been researching for a few years, then you would, but for the average punter in the street, I think they would be surprised to find these elements present. And then we have endless connections into the world of military intelligence, MI5, MI6, the CIA, these kinds of groups. Wouldn't really expect to find that there, would you? But it's there. And unfortunately, we have some more unsettling elements as well. We have unending connections into the world of pedophilia. We'll be getting into some of that. So to make these points, I've selected 3 music acts to look into and get into aspects of their affiliations and the true nature of what they were really all about. See, that's what it is about my work. I go through acts individually and I destroy people's nostalgic attachments to their youth, you know. So, as I always say, if I haven't got round to your particular group just yet, then bear with me, I will get there eventually. So, the acts I've selected this evening, I won't reveal the second 2, but the first one we're going to look at is arguably the most successful, prolific, and influential groups of all time. We're talking the Beatles. For me, they are the most fascinating group to research. Certainly their story has provided me with endless hours of complete fascination. And they really are a very interesting group to study. So we're going to be getting into some dark occult aspects of the Beatles, and there's plenty to get into. We will be revisiting this particular sleeve as we go on. Here's the Beatles in a very early pose, conducting some sort of seance in a mocking kind of fashion, but it sets the tone nicely for some of the other stuff we'll get into. So a good place to start is usually at the beginning. And when it comes to the Beatles, we can question how it was that the group came to be named in that way. So, from this excerpt in the book, when writing an article for his friend Bill Harry's Merseybeat magazine in 1961, John Lennon stated, "Many people ask, what are the Beatles? Why Beatles? Beatles. How did the name arrive? So we will tell you. It came in a vision. A man appeared on a flaming pie and said unto them, from this day on, you are the Beatles with an A. Thank you, Mr. Man," they said, thanking him. That's a typical Lennon sort of jovial, flippant quote, and it doesn't really tell you much. But many researchers feel that the group would have been named after an entity which was revered in ancient Egyptian culture. And this was a dung beetle, this particular variety of scarab beetle, which was known for rolling its dung into a ball and pushing it across the ground. And to the ancient Egyptians, this symbolized the sun rising in the sky in the east every day and being seen to roll across the sky to sunset in the west. We can see that this particular scarab beetle appears in various engravings from ancient Egypt. But going back to this book, which was put out there by the master occultist Aleister Crowley, and we will be getting into Crowley in a few ways as we go through this presentation. Among his various prolific writings, he had a book called The Winged Beetle. And it's very interesting to me that Paul McCartney was involved in two groups which took their name very loosely from the title of this book. So you had the Beatles, and then later you had Wings, which becomes very interesting. This is the coat of arms, which was put together for the guy that was known as the fifth Beatle, their producer, George Martin, coming out of the aristocracy, a very wealthy family. And within these families, you often find that they get these coat of arms drawn up. This one was done fairly late in George Martin's life. It comes from the 1990s. And interestingly, we have 3 of these scarab beetles in the crest there. And you might ask yourself, why are there only 3 rather than 4? And George Harrison was still alive, so given this was the early 90s, that might provide the answer. But if you get into research involving Paul McCartney, and whether that's the original biological Paul, it might provide a different explanation as to why there are 3 Beatles here and not 4. John Lennon grew up in this particular area of Liverpool, which is full of fascinating road names, such as Druids Cross Road. And it appears as if somebody is doing a sort of horned hand symbol there in the shadow. And then Druidsville Road, a very fascinating part of the city. He grew up on a road called Menlove Avenue, which is a name to conjure with. John Lennon's old man was a sailor, but he was also a budding musician himself, Freddie Lennon. He had a few songs put out, including this one. It was called That's My Life, although it's misspelled on this sleeve as That's My Life. And the most interesting thing about this particular sleeve, for me, is the black and white checkerboard design that we have, which is indicative of Freemasonry. This is a symbol that we find within Freemasonic orders, symbolising duality and the polarisation of light and dark, white and black, good and evil, endless expressions of duality, which we find cropping up in Freemasonry. More of that as we move on. So here we've got the original lineup of the band. The Beatles were a 5-piece, and the original bassist was a lad by the name of Stuart Sutcliffe, who was Scottish. And we also had Pete Best as the original drummer. And so this was what the group looked like in their pre-fame years. This might be a good point to give this a mention, actually, which I got handed earlier today. This is a copy of the poster advertising the Beatles' first gig right here in Stroud. Yeah. This was the Subscription Rooms, if anyone knows where that venue may have been and what it is now. This particular gig took place on the 31st of March 1962, the Beatles being supported by the Rebel Rousers. It was one of 2 gigs that the Beatles did in Stroud that year. The other one was on the 1st of September. By the 1st of September in 1962, Pete Best had been replaced by Ringo on drums. But at the time of this gig, Pete Best would still have been the drummer. The story about that is that Pete Best, back in the day, evidently was a good-looking young lad. And those that controlled the Beatles wanted the girl fans of the group to be looking at John and Paul as the frontmen and not fixing their gaze on Pete Best on the drums. So they replaced Pete Best with Ringo, problem solved. Here's an interesting picture of Stuart Sutcliffe where he's making a hand sign that we've seen on quite a few occasions. Well, I have in my research anyway. So it's what's known as the triangle of manifestation, and he's making it just above the sacral chakra there. And the idea behind this symbol is that it represents the alignment of your thoughts, emotions, and actions, mind, body, spirit. And when you get those 3 aspects all in alignment with each other, and then you imbue that symbol with your consciousness, with your will, with your intent, you can bring into physical manifestation anything which you wish to occur. So it's a symbol again which crops up in Freemasonry, and we find it in various esoteric mystery school teachings as well. So very interesting that a young lad from Liverpool, who we're told was a painter and a musician, knows all about this symbol and uses it in promotional photos. Here's another interesting picture of Stu Sutcliffe behind a gate where it appears that these swirls are forming 3 6s. So with a bit of imagination there, you could create a 666 out of that. And that's a number that we find cropping up endlessly in the music industry backstory, as we'll see. Stu Sutcliffe died at the ripe old age of 21 in 1962. And this was right before the Beatles broke through to fame in October of that year with their first single, Love Me Do. So by the time they got famous, Pete Best had been kicked out, replaced by Ringo, and Stu Sutcliffe had died. The story about Stu Sutcliffe is that he got a brain aneurysm, which is what finished him off, and there are some accounts of a fight having broken out at a Beatles gig in Liverpool, and Stuart Sutcliffe getting involved in a skirmish, and John Lennon having to rush to his aid. And during this fight, Stu Sutcliffe apparently got kicked in the head, and shortly afterwards developed this aneurysm. That's a story that's told by Pauline Sutcliffe, his sister, in her autobiography. And Pete Best seemingly got kicked out of the group because there was a Beatles associate by the name of Neil Aspinall. So there were 2 guys who accompanied the Beatles on all their gigs in those formative years. One was Mel Evans, who was their roadie, and the other was Neil Aspinall, who was a general assistant and just got involved in all aspects of Beatles management. So Neil Aspinall was the same age as the young lads in the Beatles, and unfortunately he knocked up Pete Best's mum. And the result was the birth of a boy who went by the name of Rogue Best. And seemingly the whole event was so embarrassing that Pete Best, Mona's son, could no longer continue in the group because of what had happened between Mona Best and Neil Aspinall. So that's the reason that's given for Ringo being brought in from Rory Storm and the Hurricanes to replace Pete Best on drums. So by 1962, we've got the lineup of the Beatles that we all know. The 4-piece, John, Paul, George and Ringo. In terms of where they all came from and what their true role may have been, we got a suggestion along these lines from the author of this book, which came out in 1991, called Conspirators' Hierarchy, The Story of the Committee of 300. It's written by Dr. John Coleman, who was a former British military intelligence operative. And he makes the claim in this book that the Beatles were actually a project of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London. This is a social engineering think tank which is all about shaping and moulding societal attitudes and changing the way that people think about things. It specialises in the creation of fads, trends, movements, scenes. And Coleman claims that the Beatles, as well as the Rolling Stones, were used as psychological weaponry by these groups in order to change society in the 1960s. The unfortunate thing about it is that he doesn't provide any citations or references for these claims. We're just asked to take his word for it. The Tavistock Institute was affiliated with another social engineering think tank by the name of the Frankfurt School, coming out of Germany. And there was a professor, an academic, who worked for the Frankfurt School by the name of Theodor Adorno. Coleman's claim is that Adorno was actually responsible for writing many of the lyrics to the songs that have been attributed to Lennon and McCartney. It does seem a bit of a stretch that a dusty old academic like Adorno could have been responsible for some of these songs' lyrics, but there is much evidence to suggest that Lennon and McCartney can't possibly have written the sheer number of songs that are attributed to them, because, quite simply, there wasn't enough time for this to have been done. I don't know how many of you might be familiar with the work of Mike Williams, better known as Sage of Quay. He's got some great videos on YouTube. During the 2020 lockdown, he put his time to great use by producing a 4.5-hour video in which he provided proof and evidence that during a particular period of the Beatles' heyday, when the Rubber Soul album was being put out, physically impossible for John and Paul to have written the number of songs that we're told they did, because you can trace what they were doing on each day during this time period. There's a resource online known as the Beatles Bible, and it breaks down day by day what each member of the group was doing at any given time. And as a result of the TV interviews and the press interviews and the touring and the family and home life stuff that these guys were said to be doing during that period, there was just not enough time left for them to have written all the songs that were attributed to them. So I think we've got enough evidence to show that Lennon and McCartney cannot have written all of the songs that were said they did. And that raises all kinds of questions in its wake. So this is George Martin, the aforementioned, known as the fifth Beatle, their producer from 1962 right the way through to when they split up in 1970. And George Martin cut his teeth in the recording game through working for a period at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop for those nice people in that particular institution. And so that's where he got his training, and he learnt all about how to manipulate sound and how to use sound for experimentation and to affect human consciousness and such. And so in the latter period of the Beatles, where you had some very intricate recordings and you had the orchestras being brought in and all kinds of experimentation with different aspects of sound, that was all occurring at the hand of George Martin. Certainly we can see that the Beatles' whole image and what they were putting forward in their songs changed big time midway through their career. So they got going in 1962 with Love Me Do, and in those early years they were effectively a boy band. They were putting out boy meets girl type love songs. They were innocent, they were not offensive in any way. It was she loves you, I want to hold your hand, please please me, this kind of thing. But by the time we get to 1966, and you get records like Tomorrow Never Knows, which made use of lyrics from the Tibetan Book of the Dead as translated by Dr. Timothy Leary, the acid guru, who was very much a part of the counterculture of the mid to late 1960s, the Beatles' output had changed unrecognisably. And then you had the following year the release of the Sgt. Pepper album, and we're going into Psychedelia, The Summer of Love of 1967, followed up by Magical Mystery Tour, very trippy, very out there, very LSD laden, you can see that this group was being used to shape and mould societal attitudes of the time. So over in California, you had the counterculture scene coming out of America, the flower power era, and you had all those groups that were pushing psychedelia and acid and all this stuff. In Britain, we had the counterculture scene coming out of London. It was pretty much focused on London. There were little pockets of it, maybe in Cambridge and Oxford, coming out of the universities there, but it was very much centred on London, swinging London, Carnaby Street, Twiggy, David Bailey, this kind of thing. And so the Beatles, along with other groups of the time, such as the Rolling Stones and early Pink Floyd, who, when they first emerged, were pushing psychedelic ideas and psychedelic rock music, as were Status Quo, actually. Before Status Quo settled on the style of music for which they were best known, they were dabbling in acid-laden psychedelia. So you had all these groups, and they were being used to change attitudes towards drugs, towards sex, towards family, towards society. And the whole counterculture scene involved pitting the youthful generation of that time against their parents' generation and the values that they stood for. It was divide and conquer. We've seen this so many times through the ages, and agencies such as Tavistock and Oxford and Cambridge University specialise in shaping and moulding societal attitudes in this way. So the Beatles very much played their role in that, and we can ask ourselves whether that would have been a conscious decision of these four young lads from Liverpool, or whether they would have been manipulated and coerced into making those changes to their music and to their image by unseen forces that were guiding them. We've got some very interesting symbolism to get into when we look at some of the Beatles' album sleeves. So, with the Beatles from 1963, released on the 22nd of March 1963, so it's 322. This is the number of death within the Skull and Bones fraternity coming out of Yale University. It's also the spring equinox, 22nd of March, and it's the beginning of a period which in the occult calendar is known as a 40-day season of sacrifice. So we've got the four lads here with one half of their faces in shadow, leaving one of their eyes showing. So it's one-eye symbolism. And we've seen this so many times with so many acts through the ages, it's still being done today. And it's symbolically communicating the idea of embracing one's shadow self, and also the all-seeing eye, the so-called eye of providence and the eye of Horus, the eye of illumination, symbolising the pineal gland, this portal to higher levels of consciousness. So again, we can ask the question, could four young lads from Liverpool who just happened to have made it big, out of all the groups that emerged out of the music clubs in Liverpool at that time, this group, through hard work and good luck and playing a few gigs and writing a few catchy songs, just happened to find themselves this level of success and influence? Is it likely that that would have happened under their own steam? Or is it more realistic that that could only have happened with the help of certain unseen forces? And could it be these unseen forces that would have coerced them into embracing this style of symbolism? Because this sleeve is very far from alone. On the Beatles' 65 album, we see them posing underneath umbrellas. So umbrellas have been identified as a trigger within MK Ultra style mind control programming. MK Ultra coming out of those nice people at the CIA, you know, who just want to keep us safe and look after us all. Same as MI5 does with us, you know. That's what they're there for. So as well as being a mind control trigger, and we find trauma-based mind control throughout the music industry, as we'll discover as we go through, the word umbrella itself becomes interesting to study. Getting into the etymology, one interpretation of it is late 16th century, it denotes a phantom or a ghost, from the Latin, meaning literally shade, the word umbra, from which we get umbrella. Then we have the sleeve to the Help album from 1965, which accompanied the movie of the same name. And here we have the four Beatles seemingly striking semaphore poses. So this is using bodily poses to communicate certain letters. So you would assume that what's going on here is that they're spelling out the H-E-L-P of the word help. But it turns out that what we actually have is a rendition of what were known as grade signs coming out of the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis. This is one of the occult mystery school secret societies which was once held by Aleister Crowley, who crops up like the proverbial bad penny throughout this story. And so what we find is that the Beatles are mimicking some of the grade signs that came out of this arcane, obscure secret society. A pertinent question to ask. Dodgy, nefarious affiliations. Here we've got the Beatles hanging out with Jimmy Savile. Jimmy Savile's got his black and white checkered coat there, again symbolising mind control and a symbol coming out of Freemasonry. Jimmy Savile, for a period during 1964, went out on the road with the Beatles as their compere and toured with them. Can you imagine anything worse than being on tour with Jimmy Savile? Apart from having him round your house for Christmas for about 15 years straight, like Margaret Thatcher reportedly did. So here's another one of the Beatles goofing around with Savile. They're all pretending to be asleep, or could it be hypnotised? Is that what's going on here? Paul McCartney, or is it? I'll let that one sink in. Is very keen on distancing himself from people that he'd prefer not to be associated with anymore. So when the truth emerged about Jimmy Savile in 2012, McCartney in interviews started making comments like, oh well, we always thought there was something a bit creepy about him, we never really liked him. But the pictures tell a different story because they did like larking and goofing around with Savile a fair bit. Now we have a series of poses which speak 1,000 stories, where you've got Paul and John putting their hand inside their jacket, symbolising the hidden hand, and again being a visual expression of Freemasonry. If it was just the one picture, we could possibly write it off as random, or them just messing about, or the photographer asking them to do it. But we have many such pictures. Here's Paul, if it is him, and John striking the same pose as, who's that? Lord Admiral Nelson, I think, or somebody of such ilk. Napoleon, okay. And here we've got another one with Paul placing his hand inside the jacket. So it's something they seem quite keen on communicating to those who have the eyes to see and who can interpret what's going on. Then we have more one-eye symbolism going on, where one eye is being covered up. We see this all the way up to present day. You may have seen there's a montage which has been doing the rounds on the internet. It's got like 100 or so pop stars, and they're all covering one eye. It's usually covering the right eye. It's everyone from Beyonce to Lady Gaga to Bob Dylan, you name it. And here we've got John Lennon back in the day doing the same thing. Here's several pictures of McCartney, if indeed it is the same man. I mean, if we look at the top row, is the man on the top right the same man as the one on the top left? I would suggest not. This opens up a whole can of worms when we get into the Paul McCartney conspiracy. The idea that the real Paul McCartney died in 1966 and was replaced by an imposter who's been playing the public role ever since. My stance on this whole subject area has changed somewhat over the years. So in my first book, Musical Truth Volume 1, which I put out in early 2016, I was chronicling this whole conspiracy theory idea, and it's actually the largest chapter in the book at 15,000 words, really going into all these visual clues and indicators that seem to have been put out there to suggest that the real McCartney died in 1966 and is no longer with us. I don't necessarily subscribe to that idea anymore, but one thing which I can say with absolute certainty is there's been more than one Paul McCartney put out there on the public stage. So whether that means that the individual we have today is the original biological Paul McCartney, or whether it's somebody else, I don't know, but certainly we've had more than one individual playing that public role. And I would suggest that on the top row there, the man on the top right is a different individual to the man on the top left, whoever they may be. But interestingly, from all these different time frames through the decades, we've got McCartney covering one eye in exactly the same way mid-interview. Would that be some random, meaningless thing, or is there some symbolic meaning being communicated here? Then we have this image from the Yellow Submarine album, released in 1968, where we've got two very familiar hand signals denoting the so-called Illuminati, you know, this secret society structure which seems to covertly control every aspect of organised society. So you've got McCartney giving it the 666 sign, which is what that's said to indicate. It's said to look like a figure 6, with the 3 fingers denoting that it's 3 times, so it's 666. And then you've got John Lennon giving the horned hand sign, which is said to be evocative of Baphomet, this entity so revered by many of these secret societies that we're talking about in control of these different institutions. Very interesting handshake here between Lennon and McCartney. I'm told that's very Freemasonic. Not being a Mason myself, despite what you might hear about me, I can't be sure, but I'm told that is a Masonic handshake. So this may give us some clue and some indication as to where the Beatles came from and why it was them, above and beyond all other groups, that were groomed for this level of success and influence. Certainly there's a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest that in their early days, the Beatles were not a particularly good group when they played live. There were many groups whose ability and prowess far outshone that of the Beatles, but for some reason, this was the group that went on to become arguably the most successful of all time. John Lennon's relationship with Yoko Ono, that really is an interesting one. John Lennon was a very enigmatic character. It's very difficult to get a handle on his true nature. He seemed to be very contradictory. In the early years of the Beatles, he was known for larking around and joking around. And one thing he liked to do was to make fun of disabled people. That was how he got his kicks, according to Cynthia, his first wife, writing in one of her books. That was how John used to conduct himself. But by the 1970s, he'd become a political activist, and he was putting out music that was very conscious and indicated an individual with a social conscience, very concerned about different aspects of the world and where it was headed and who was controlling things. So he was a very self-contradictory character. My personal feelings on the subject are that John Lennon and George Harrison came to regret what it was they'd been a part of in their post-Beatles years. So this is consistent with the idea that the Beatles were a social engineering project, and that the members would have known what it was they were involved with, but John and George seemed to be quite troubled by this when they launched their solo careers. So George went down a more spiritual path. He embraced Eastern mysticism, and these themes crept into many of his solo songs, whereas Lennon was very outspoken about the control system, what we might term now the New World Order, and this got into many of his songs. So right about the time that he started to become politically active and socially conscious, Yoko Ono pops up in his world. And many researchers feel that she would have been inserted into his life as some sort of mind control handler. There's some evidence to suggest that John was subject to mind control programming, possibly Paul as well, which we see in so many groups. And Yoko would have been playing the part of his handler. It's a very strange relationship because she was some years older than him. She was born in 1933, John was born in 1940, and John seemed to have some very complicated psychological mother issues. So his mother was killed when he was 14 years old. And she was mown down in a car being driven by an off-duty policeman. You couldn't make it up. Paul McCartney lost his mother to illness in 1956. He was 14 years of age. So the two prominent members of this group both lost their mothers at the same kind of age. So when Yoko came into John's life, she seemed to fulfill that mother archetype within his world. And he even referred to her as mother. That's what he would call her. It's a very strange thing. So there are lots of questions we can ask ourselves about Yoko and where she came from. We get some indication into that when we settle upon a certain town in Rochester County, New York. This is a town by the name of Scarsdale. And it's in Scarsdale that a young Linda Eastman, to give her a maiden name, the real family name was actually Epstein. So we're talking Linda Eastman, who went on to become Linda McCartney, Paul's wife. The real family name was Epstein. They were Lithuanian Jews, and Linda's father, his real name was Leopold Epstein. When he landed in America, he changed his name to Lee Eastman to sound more American and to fit in. So Linda grew up in Scarsdale, attended high school there. Round about the same time, in the 1950s, Yoko Ono's family lands in Scarsdale, New York, and base themselves there. Yoko's mother was descended from the Emperor of Japan. So she's coming out of a Japanese aristocratic bloodline. And often we find it's through the mother's family connections that we get all these interesting aspects of ancestry. Yoko Ono's father was in charge of a Japanese banking dynasty. And he split his time between working in Japan and America. And when he was in America, he based himself in Scarsdale. So in this small, relatively obscure town that very few people have heard of, we have two women who would go on to become the wives of the two prominent members of arguably the most successful band of all time. Would that occur at the hands of random chance and happenstance, or is there more to know about Scarsdale and what goes on there? The symbolism continues, unfortunately, through John Lennon's sons. So this is Sean Lennon, the son that he had with Yoko, and this is a shot from one of his solo projects where he's got a pyramid hat with an all-seeing eye, the Eye of Horus. And of course, symbolism is not just limited to dark occult applications. Satanists do not have the monopoly on signs and symbols. They are available to be used by anyone, and any degree of consciousness or intent can be imbued into a symbol. But from what we've seen of the corporate-controlled music industry and those that operate it, 9 times out of 10 it's used for great harm and for mind control and for purposes such as this, rather than to uplift and enrich all of humanity. So here we've got Sean rocking these two very familiar so-called Illuminati signs and symbols. And then John's other son, Julian, who we had with his first wife, Cynthia, in one of his solo projects, is given another rendition of this all-seeing eye idea. These are calling cards of those that control these different institutions. So we're back to this rather disturbing sleeve that we started off with, and it's for a 1966 compilation album called Yesterday and Today. So the Beatles appeared for no apparent reason and with no explanation in butcher's smocks, covered with raw meat and with various body parts from dolls all across their bodies. And at the time there was outrage, quite understandably, about this sleeve being put out there. People couldn't understand what was being communicated, and there seemed to be no apparent reason for them having meat and baby body parts all over them. So with the benefit of hindsight and being able to do this nature of research now in this time, we can ask ourselves whether the group may have been clued in on this very disturbing practice of infanticide, the killing of children, of babies, which we're told goes on within these so-called elite circles. Is it possible that they were communicating aspects of this into the subconscious mind of the viewing public back in 1966, at a time when nobody outside of those circles could have been expected to understand what was being communicated here? But now, in these times, through being able to research these subjects, we can maybe put a different slant on things. So this photo shoot was directed by an Australian photographer by the name of Robert Whittaker. There were about 13 shots taken in this particular set. Here's another one where Paul, or whoever it is looking in a trance-like state, as if mind-controlled, the 1,000-yard stare, as it's known. Paul looks skyward like an angel of death. An umbilical cord dangles limply from his wrist. It was very tasty meat, a quote attributed to Paul McCartney, which is an interesting quote to come from one of the world's most famous vegetarians, right? So then that version of Yesterday and Today was withdrawn. It's since become extremely rare. If you look on eBay, you can get an idea of the sort of prices that an original vinyl copy of that album will now fetch. It's in the hundreds of thousands of pounds. So it was then replaced by this sleeve for the same album, which sees Paul sitting inside a casket. Go figure. Of all the group members, why would it be Paul, around whom we have all these rumours of him having died in 1966? This was the very year that this album came out. And just finally with the Beatles, the body count when it comes to this particular group tends to be rather high. And with every passing year, we get fewer and fewer people who were around in the very early days of that group who can tell you a story or two about where they really came from and how they really got started. So we have Ringo, but he wasn't an original member of the group. He's 81 now. Pete Best, the drummer, the original drummer, is still alive. He's about 80 or 81, but he does very few interviews, and he's never said anything through the years to give any indication that there's anything more to know about the Beatles than the official version of things. Yoko Ono is still around in her late 80s, but I wouldn't expect to get a whole lot of sense out of her. We have May Pang, who was the secretary for John and Yoko for a period in the 1970s, and John ended up having an affair with May Pang with the blessing of his wife, Yoko Ono. This was during John's Lost Weekend period, as it's known, around about 1973-74, when John and Yoko's marriage was hitting a rough patch, and Yoko suggested that John go over to Los Angeles and shack up with May Pang, their secretary, start a sexual affair with her, and go out and do a whole load of drink and drugs with Harry Nilsson and various other people on LA's Sunset Strip. Very understanding and accommodating wife. Don't think mine would see things that way. But that's who May Pang was, so she would doubtless have a story or two to tell, but again, she's been very tight-lipped and she's never revealed anything in interviews that go outside of the official version of things. Left. I mean, if you accept that's the original Paul McCartney, he's still around, but don't expect anything controversial from him. There's a reason why John and George are dead, and Sir Paul and Sir Ringo aren't. So during the COVID scamdemic, you had Sir Ringo and Sir Paul telling their fans to put on a goon muzzle and do everything your government tells you and stay at home and do everything by Zoom. Just as the government was saying, just as the mainstream media was saying, reinforcing the official message, no problem, no rocking the boat as far as those two were concerned. Whereas I like to think if George Harrison and John Lennon had still been around in 2020, they would have had a thing or two to say about what was going on. I like to think that would be the case anyway. So beyond these, there are very few characters still around that can tell you anything about those early days of the Beatles. So we've covered Stu Sutcliffe, the original bassist. In the middle, we have the Beatles manager, Brian Epstein. Interestingly, we've got Linda's father, Leopold Epstein. We've got Brian Epstein, and we've got Jeffrey Epstein, or Epstein. And as far as I can make out, or any other researcher can make out, these three individuals are actually not related. It appears to be that rarest of situations, a coincidence that we have Epsteins cropping up in this story. So Brian Epstein put the Beatles on the map, he signed their deal with their record label, but he turned up dead in August 1967 at the age of 32 in some very suspicious circumstances. We're told he took an overdose, but there seems to be more to the story than that. Over on the top right, we've got Dr. Richard Asher, who was the father of Jane Asher, who was the girlfriend for a long period in the 1960s of Paul McCartney. Dr. Asher was involved in research into different aspects of mind control, and specifically hypnosis and sleep conditions. Paul moved in with Jane and the rest of the Asher family at their home in Wimpole Mews in London for a long period in the 60s. And many researchers feel that Paul served as a mind control subject, test subject, for Dr. Asher during the time that he was there. There's also the suggestion that many of Paul's famous songs could have been subliminally implanted into his mind as an aspect of Dr. Asher's work. Well, anyway, by the time Paul had split with Jane Asher and he'd taken up with Linda Eastman and actually married her in 1969, Dr. Asher goes missing from the family home for several days. Family looks all over the house, they can't find him. A few days later, he turns up dead in the basement, and we're told he committed suicide. So it's one of very many strange and bizarre deaths that surround this group. Down on the bottom left, we've got Mel Evans, who was the Beatles' roadie and close associate. Mel was all due to publish a biography spilling the beans about his time with the group. The manuscript was all ready. It was due to go to the publishers in very early 1976. On the 5th of January 1976, Mel Evans got shot to death by the LAPD during a skirmish which erupted in his home. And the manuscript mysteriously went missing, never to be seen to this day. Many feel that there was something in there concerning the replacement of Paul McCartney, and that at any cost that would have had to have been covered up. Then we have John Lennon, who was assassinated, we're told, by Mark Chapman on the 8th of December 1980 outside the Dakota Building in New York. There's lots of evidence to suggest that Chapman actually wasn't the assassin, but he was another mind-controlled patsy who'd been programmed and conditioned to take the blame for having shot Lennon, but that actually he was shot by a known CIA assassin going by the name of Jose Perdomo, who was working as the doorman on the Dakota Building on that particular night. Lots more to know about that one. Then George Harrison, who finally died in December of 2001. George was violently attacked inside his home in Friar Park, Henley-on-Thames in December 1999. An intruder by the name of Michael Abram broke into his house, got through an extremely elaborate security system, somehow was able to bypass it. George challenged him on the stairs of their home and got stabbed many times, got rushed to hospital. Shortly after that, he contracted cancer as a result of the attack. He lived for another 2 years, but he died at the end of 2001 at the age of 58. And that's the unfortunate story of the Beatles. Another group, we're going to do a deep dive on this one, then we're going to take our break, and we're going to come back in part 2 with another act. So we're now going into the group that were pitched as the apparent rivals to the Beatles. It's the Rolling Stones And this is a shortened version of a full presentation that I gave at the Questioning History Conference last summer, really going in on the Rolling Stones. So this group was put together by founding member Brian Jones, who we see down here in the foreground with his devil's fork, giving you a little clue, perhaps. So his real name was Lewis Brian Hopkins Jones. The family came out of Wales and they relocated to Cheltenham, just down the road. Earlier today, I passed by one of Brian Jones's former homes. It's now a curry house, I believe. So he put the group together before Mick and Keith and all the others joined. And the mentor to the Rolling Stones was this guy, an individual by the name of Alexis Corner, who was a jazz blues musician, and he worked with Brian Jones to put together the earliest incarnation of the Rolling Stones. Then Mick and Keith were brought in after that. I've got here a little video snippet of Brian Jones speaking in a rare interview. The reason I wanted to play it is because I want you to focus on the way that Brian speaks. It's only a few seconds, so with any luck, this is going to work.
Let's face it, the future as a Rolling Stone is very uncertain. My ultimate aim in life was never to be a pop star. I enjoy it, with reservations, but I'm not really sort of satisfied either artistically or personally.
So he's talking there about how he never wanted to be a rock star. It wasn't his first choice of what he wanted to do with his life, and he never felt fully satisfied doing it, which is an interesting thing for somebody in that position to say, given that he was part of one of the most successful rock groups of the 1960s. He almost seems to be suggesting that he was coerced into being a part of this group. And the other takeaway from that video footage for me is just how posh he sounds. You know, he's got that real public school accent. And the Rolling Stones were pitched as the kind of rough and ready alternative to the Beatles. So we had a dialectic going on here. For those people who didn't really like the Beatles in their earliest incarnation, because they might have thought they were a bit soft and a bit squeaky clean, well, you had a more rough, around the edges alternative to the Beatles in the form of the Rolling Stones. So if that's how you liked your music, and that's how you liked your groups, then they would be the one for you. But we have a suggestion that the Beatles and the Rolling Stones actually came out of the same camp. And Coleman, in his book Conspirators' Hierarchy, states that the Rolling Stones were another creation of Tavistock, and you had this dialectic whereby young music fans of the day were being directed to either the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. It didn't really matter which group you gravitated towards because the agendas being pushed were the same either way. Both groups ultimately embraced drug culture, and both groups were involved in changing societal attitudes during that time. So another institution which specialises in social engineering of this nature is the LSE, the London School of Economics. And we find that Mick Jagger, frontman of the Rolling Stones, just happened to study at the LSE. Is that a natural career path? In the same way that Brian Jones is saying that he never really expected to end up in a rock band, we find Mick Jagger studying at the LSE, and most people coming out of there end up as lawyers or, you know, financial analysts or whatever it may be, rather than the grizzled, hedonistic frontmen of debaucherous rock groups. And yet that's what Jagger has done with his career. So was he getting his grooming at the LSE, and was it all about preparing him for his role in changing societal attitudes? Is that where Jagger came from? And is that what the Rolling Stones as a vehicle were being used for? The pushing of agendas, which suits the control system, which sits atop all these different aspects of organised society. So reinforcing this idea of the Rolling Stones being slightly loutish and these rougher alternatives to the Beatles, we had this story coming out of the 1960s concerning the Stones being banned from the town of Blackpool for a total of 44 years. And this was as a result of a concert in 1964 which erupted into chaos and violence, and people were smashing chairs over each other's heads and all this kind of stuff. And this reinforced this image of the Rolling Stones as being this edgy, dangerous kind of band. But it would appear that that event would have been completely contrived in order to reinforce this image of them. So they were put out there as rivals, and yet the Rolling Stones and the Beatles were actually great friends. They used to socialise together, hang out and go to parties together. We've got a picture here of Jagger and John Lennon from back in the 60s, and then from more recent times, McCartney hanging out with Mick Jagger. Friends, very far from rivals. There's a lot of crossover when it comes to personnel between these two groups as well, which can give us a clue. So the individual that we have second from the left, in the glasses, is a guy by the name of Andrew Loog Oldham. And he was employed as a publicist by both of these groups. So he started out with the Rolling Stones, and then he jumped ship and went over to the Beatles and started doing their publicity. And there was also an attorney by the name of Alan Klein who worked with both groups as well. And both the Beatles and the Rolling Stones latterly accused Alan Klein of ripping them off and of huge sums of money going missing at his hands. Alan Klein also worked for the soul singer Sam Cooke. And again, there were complaints from the family of Sam Cooke regarding large sums of money inexplicably going missing when he was brought in. So we have another consistent factor between the two groups there. The Rolling Stones had these two women who were a part of the group's journey throughout their formative years. I refer to them as the Rolling Stones concubines because that seems to be the role that they fulfilled. So we got Marianne Faithfull and we got Anita Pallenberg. So they were girlfriends of various members of the Rolling Stones. It seemed to have been very cosy and very permissive and very liberal within the Rolling Stones camp, because Anita Pallenberg was in a relationship with Brian Jones. Then after Brian died, which we'll get to, she seems to have taken up with Keith Richards, and I think she had a go at Mick Jagger as well, probably. Mick Jagger was in a relationship with Marianne Faithfull, and I think Marianne sort of popped up with other members of the group as well, so it was all very understanding, you know. So here's Anita with Keith, and here's Mick with Marianne. Interesting thing about Marianne Faithfull, again on her mother's side, as I said, we can learn so much from looking at the genealogy, the ancestry of mothers of famous people. It tends to be that when there are connections into the world of military intelligence, this comes through the fathers, such as Jim Morrison of the Doors, his father being the Navy Admiral in charge of the fleet of ships involved in the Gulf of Tonkin false flag incident, which springboarded America into the Vietnam War. Bob Marley's father was also a Navy officer, British naval officer. But when it comes to the mothers, we find that through her mother, Madonna is linked to Ellen DeGeneres, Lady Gaga, and Celine Dion. They're all cousins, with French-Canadian ancestry coming through the mother's bloodline. With Yoko, remember, she comes down through the bloodline of the Japanese emperor, coming through her mother's family. And when it comes to Marianne Faithfull, on her mother's side, she's descended from the Masok family, coming out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it's through the Masok family that we get the term Masochism, as in sadomasochism. That's the family we're dealing with here. So these people don't just pop up randomly out of nowhere. They're specially selected for these influential roles, where they know they're going to affect the consciousness and the behaviours of millions of people. Those kind of positions aren't just left to any old randoms. They are reserved only for those who come from the right bloodlines. Far from the first time we've seen this in the rock music world, Jimmy Page was in a relationship with a rock music groupie by the name of Laurie Maddox, nicknamed Lightning Laurie, when she was 14 years old. And she tells the story that before Jimmy Page got there, David Bowie had a go the previous year when she was 13 years of age. And here we have the story of Bill Wyman with a 13-year-old Mandy Smith. And Mandy's spoken out quite a bit about this in recent years. The marriage didn't last. Are you surprised to learn? Didn't really last very long. So in this quote from this article, Mandy Smith says, "If it happened today, he, Bill Wyman, would be absolutely vilified by the press. He'd be in jail. For me, for a long time, it was a grey area. I was underage, but I was complicit." And later, she called for the age of consent to rise from 16 upwards. She says, "I don't think most 16-year-olds are ready." But even despite all of this, Bill Wyman did no jail time. Here we've got a sleeve to an interestingly named album, which was called Their Satanic Majesty's Request. It's a good one to present on Jubilee weekend, isn't it? And this was the Rolling Stones dabbling into the world of psychedelia, just for the one album, which was released in December 1967. This was 6 months after the Beatles had put out their landmark iconic album Sgt. Pepper's in June of '67. So the sleeve to Their Satanic Majesties was a kind of pastiche or an homage to this incredible montage that we had on the sleeve of Sgt. Pepper. But there's something very interesting beyond that. If you do a close analysis of all the imagery in the sleeve of this Rolling Stones album, you find the 4 members of the Beatles embedded within the imagery there. So Paul, George, John and Ringo, there they are. Another indication that these two groups were very far from rivals, up against each other, but were actually in on the whole thing alongside each other. So we just learnt that's a bit loud, so let me turn that down a bit. Thinking about the Rolling Stones dabbling in dark occultism and ideas of Satanism, is there a particular song that springs to mind? Yeah. Let's take a little look at Sympathy for the Devil. We've got a little excerpt from it here, one of the group's best known songs, endlessly played on the radio, and pay close attention to the way the band are behaving as the song progresses.
Pleased to meet you. Hope you guess my name. Oh yeah. But what's puzzling you is just the nature of my game. Stuck around St. Petersburg when I saw it was the time for a change. Killed us all and his ministers, Anastasia screaming vague. I rode the train, had a generous rank. I went to blitzkrieg rage and the body stank. Pleased to meet you. Hope you guess my name. Ah yeah. But what's confusing you is just the nature of my game. Watch your glee, while your kings and queens, for the tender days, for the God save me. I'm shining out, yeah, on the Kennedy. When after all, it was you and me. So let me please introduce myself. I'm a man of wealth and taste. And I ain't track for what troubadours who can't hear before they reach by me.
So by that point in their career, Brian had been relegated to playing maracas. That was his role in the group. And I don't know if you got the same impression as me, apart from the fact that that's some catchy shit and it really embeds itself in your mind, and I'm going to have that song on my mind for the rest of the evening, is how animated Jagger seems to become as the performance progresses. So it's almost as if he's being taken over. And it's interesting that that's the theme of the song. One thing about the lyrics is when that song was being written in 1968, the original line was, I killed Kennedy, referring to JFK, And Jagger tells the story that just as he was putting the song together, the news came in that Bobby Kennedy, his brother, had also been assassinated in June of '68, so he changed the lyric to "I killed the Kennedys." That's the story behind that song. But it represents a very direct link between the Rolling Stones and the idea of the devil and evil and Satanism and such, these different ideas. So we've got a link here between Marianne Faithfull and the Process Church of the Final Judgment, which is this religious group coming out of California. It's got connections to various people: Charles Manson, Sirhan Sirhan, who's said to have assassinated the aforementioned Robert Kennedy, and also David Berkowitz, known as the son of Sam Killer. They've all got connections into the Process Church. So in this excerpt from the book, after brief sexual dalliances with Brian Jones and Keith Richards, Marianne Faithfull eventually left her husband and began a 4-year relationship with Mick Jagger in 1966. She too was fascinated by the occult and was briefly involved in the Process Church of the Final Judgment, a religious group founded in London in the early 1960s by former Scientologists Mary and Robert de Grimston. In his book Turn Off Your Mind, The Mystic 60s and the Dark Side of the Age of Aquarius, Gary Lachman quotes Faithfull as saying of the Process, "I was attracted to them at first, mostly because they took me seriously when nobody else did. They were very admiring of me. They must have recognised that I've got magic powers." This is Kenneth Anger, who was a satanic filmmaker in the 1960s. He's still around now, he's in his late 80s now. He was affiliated quite closely with the Rolling Stones. Anger was a student of the works of Aleister Crowley, and what we have here is an image of Kenneth Anger alongside Alfred Kinsey, who was a sexologist, so-called, who came out of the 1960s, was also involved in changing societal attitudes towards sex and family and such. And the pair of them were very much into the works of Crowley. And they're pictured here at the Abbey of Thelema in Sicily, which is where Crowley set up a temple dedicated to his Thelema religious doctrine. So these two are out there paying a pilgrimage and trying to restore this temple for this short film titled Lucifer Rising. And there were 2 different soundtracks which were produced for this movie. Earlier, he put out a short film called Invocation of My Demon Brother, and the soundtrack for this was composed by Mick Jagger on a Moog synthesizer. By the time Lucifer Rising had come out, Kenneth Anger was said to have been in a homosexual relationship with Bobby Beausoleil, who was one of the so-called disciples of Charles Manson. And Bobby Beausoleil was jailed for the murder of a music teacher by the name of Gary Hinman. And in jail, Beausoleil composed the first soundtrack for Kenneth Anger's Lucifer Rising. There was a second soundtrack which was later produced for this film, ready for its re-release, and it was put together by Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin fame, also an acolyte of Aleister Crowley. What I've got here is a short film piece involving Kenneth Anger being asked about the incident where Jimmy Page put together this soundtrack but was late delivering it and later fell mysteriously ill. So take a listen to it and have a look at Anger's mannerisms and see if this is the kind of guy you'd like to have around your house for a cup of tea. Have you taken a vaccine?
Just one question regarding Jimmy Page. Well, let's go. Did the decline in his guitar playing in 1976 have anything to do with his failure to deliver your soundtrack? No. The reason why he didn't deliver the soundtrack was that he had a problem with heroin, and that was interfering with his work. And I tried to help him get over it because it was really interfering with his life. He's a very wonderful person, and I think eventually, I hope he has got over it now.
Creepy guy, huh? That's who the Rolling Stones were hanging out with back in the 60s. And this brings us to the death of the founder member of the Rolling Stones, Brian Jones. So he became a member of this fabled 27 Club, which is the large number of musicians who just happen to have turned up dead at the age of 27 in some bizarre circumstance or other. So in the case of Brian Jones, this was on the 3rd of July, 1969. And that turned out to be a pretty unfortunate year for the Rolling Stones. So here Brian is pictured in the garden of his cottage, Cotchford farmhouse. This is it, once owned by A.A. Milne, creator of Winnie the Pooh, reported to be a paedophile, but why would that even be a surprise? And this is the swimming pool in which Brian Jones drowned in the early hours of 3rd of July 1969. Incidentally, this date was 2 years to the day before, we're told, Jim Morrison turned up dead in the bathtub in his apartment in Paris on the 3rd of July 1971, also at the age of 27.
About midnight, Jones went for a swim with his Swedish girlfriend, Anna Bolin, and another friend, Mr. Frank Thorogood. After a time, Mr. Thorogood and the gal went back to the house. When they returned, they saw Jones at the bottom of the pool, and they pulled him out.
Charlie phoned me up. Phone went about 3 in the morning, and I just got off to sleep after about an hour. Charlie phoned me up, and he just said, "Brian died." I couldn't believe it. Then Nick flew to Australia to do Ned Kelly. Keith was working in the studio. Me and Charlie went to the funeral. When we drove through Cheltenham, all the streets were packed with people. I've never seen anything like it. It was like a coronation, I think.
So just Bill Wyman and Charlie Watts turned up to Brian's funeral just down the road in Cheltenham. The other group members were evidently too busy. Most suspicion for the murder of Brian Jones, if you don't accept that it was an accident, falls on this man, Frank Thorogood, who was a bodyguard for the Rolling Stones for a period, and also he was a builder by trade, and he'd been employed by Brian to undertake some renovation work on the cottage. And some of the people that were present that night have pointed the finger of blame at Frank Thorogood. Thorogood himself died in 1993, but the story did not die with him. In 2013, Thorogood's daughter, Jan Bell, spoke to the UK's Daily Mail, that paragon of truth and virtue, to claim that her father had told her of a vicious row between Jones and other members of the Stones on the day of his death. She'd related this story as part of her report to Sussex police, she said, but the police had decided to take no action on it. It's a surprise, isn't it? Thorogood's claim was that Mick Jagger and Keith Richards had visited the farmhouse to ask Jones to agree to a financial settlement for giving over the name of the Rolling Stones. A row reportedly broke out when Jones refused. According to Thorogood, Richards then drew a knife on Jones in anger. Thorogood is said to have calmed everyone down, after which Jagger and Richards left the property. Within 24 hours, Brian's dead. And then within a few days of that, the Rolling Stones performed their famous free concert in London's Hyde Park with Brian Jones's replacement in place. So they seem to have got over it fairly quickly. As I mentioned, 1969 was a very bad year for the group, and it ended on a sour note on the 6th of December when the Rolling Stones played at the Altamont racetrack in California. This event was captured in the movie Gimme Shelter, and it was notorious because there were 4 members of the audience at that event who died during that concert. It was the Rolling Stones along with various other groups. One young couple died in a drowning accident when their car went into a river. There was also a drugs overdose, but the most notorious death was that of an 18-year-old lad by the name of Meredith Hunter. And he was stabbed to death by Hell's Angels, who'd been hired to do the security at that event while the Rolling Stones were performing. So many people suspect that this was some sort of ritual sacrifice which had been pre-planned. We got some footage from that concert here involving the moment in question.
We're splitting, man, if those cats don't stop beating everybody up inside. I want them out of the way, man. I don't like unity. The guy's got a gun out there.
Hey, people! Hey, people! Come on, let's be cool. People, please. There's no reason to hassle anybody. Please don't do that.
So also performing at Altamont were the group Jefferson Airplane, and Grace Slick from that group is said to have picked up on the strange vibrations that day, recalling that the vibes were bad. Something was very peculiar, not particularly bad, just real peculiar. I'd expected the loving vibes of Woodstock, but that wasn't coming at me. This was a whole different thing. That event involving that guy getting stabbed to death got captured on film, and according to some who were present, the young cameraman who captured it just happened to be an individual by the name of George Lucas. Anyone heard of him? He won't go anywhere. Nothing will come of him. So this leads some to suspect that this was some kind of initiation ritual for George Lucas, preparing him for his film career, given that he captured this whole event on celluloid. The name Lucas is said to be derived from Lucifer, incidentally, the light bearer. And bringing things all the way up to 2014, you know, we've gone from 1969 to 2014, nothing really interesting happened in that time, you know. But latterly, Mick Jagger had a girlfriend by the name of Lorraine Scott, who was a fashion designer. She turned up dead, unexpectedly, after reportedly hanging herself with a red silk scarf. And this was during a spate of such deaths that we were getting from the fashion world, Alexander McQueen and Kate Spade and various others. We're told that it was a suicide, but there's lots of suggestions that it was anything but that. She was said to be making plans for the future, she's said to be in good spirits, and not someone that you would expect to be ready to take themselves out of here. So it's another death in the Rolling Stones story, and inevitably it leads to suggestions that it's again some sort of ritual sacrifice connected to Mick Jagger and involving his continued success in the industry. And then would anyone be that surprised to discover from this story Jeffrey Epstein had 301 Britons in his little black book, including Mick Jagger, Tony Blair and Richard Branson, FBI files reveal. I did hear an anecdote related to Mick Jagger a few years ago, actually. I've got no way of verifying it because it's impossible to prove this, but somebody told me that they once found themselves on a flight in first class, seated next to Mick Jagger. And he'd had a few drinks, so he'd become a bit loose-tongued. And he told this woman, my role has been to degrade morals and debase the consciousness of young people. Apparently that's what he said. this would certainly be consistent with what he was being groomed and trained for during his years at the London School of Economics. And if that anecdote turns out to be valid, then that's what he's been doing ever since. And that is the unfortunate story involving dark occult aspects of the Rolling Stones. Who should we do next? Thanks very much. I do have one more act to discuss with you this evening, but we're doing that in part 2. So right now we'll take a little comfort break of around about 20 minutes. I've got copies of all my books over here at the table if anyone's interested. And other than that, stretch your legs, enjoy yourselves, and I'll see you back here in about 20 minutes. Thank you.
Ready for part 2?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thanks very much. Who should we go in on next? So, just out of interest, by way of a show of hands, how many people here would have considered themselves Beatles fans? Okay, that's about 2/3 of the room, I think. How about the Rolling Stones? Slightly less, not quite half. Okay. So, let's see who we're going to go in on next when it comes to occult aspects of them. Yes, Prince. Now, I would have considered myself a fan of Prince's music. I really liked his output. I found the guy fascinating. He's a real genius, born to be a performer. You can't imagine him doing anything else with his life. I can't imagine Prince flipping burgers at McDonald's instead of doing what he did. So let's get into certain aspects of Prince. This was a presentation that I delivered in full for the first time last month at Truth Seekers Northeast in Newcastle. So this is a slightly abridged version of that. There were 3 major solo acts in the 1980s who could be considered the most influential of that decade. So that would be Prince, Madonna, and Michael Jackson. There's a surprising amount of parallels between them. So they were all born in the summer of 1958. In Prince's case, 7th of June. In Madonna's case, 16th of August, which just happens to be the date on which Elvis Presley died in 1977, on the laugh, you know. Also, on the 16th of August, Robert Johnson, the blues musician, died in 1938, another member of the 27 Club. Also on the 16th of August, Aretha Franklin died. So you had the King of Blues, the Queen of Soul, and the King of Rock all dying on the 16th of August, which just happens to be Madonna's birthday. Interesting. Then Michael Jackson, also born in 1958. Now, all these artists were born in the Midwest region of the United States. They all came from relatively poor households, and they all reportedly had abusive fathers. And we find quite a few parallels in their music as well. So we know what happened to Prince, we know what happened to Michael Jackson, and Madonna's still with us. So that's what happens when you obediently toe the line and push the agendas that your handlers have laid out there for you. Michael Jackson was very outspoken about the industry and different aspects of it and how it operates, and we saw how that ended up, and Prince was in the same way, which we'll get on to. Prince went by quite a number of pseudonyms, as well as the name for which we know him the most. He was also known for a period as the artist formerly known as Prince, and we'll get into the reasons for that. Other pseudonyms have included Camille, Joey Coco, The Kid in the movie Purple Rain, Alexander Nevermind, Jamie Starr, Tora Tora, Christopher Tracy, and his Royal Badness. And the first thing I think of whenever I hear about alter egos and pseudonyms is trauma-based mind control, which I've studied to quite a degree when it comes to the entertainment industry. We find this in the world of Hollywood movies, we find it in the world of television, and we definitely find it in the world of music. So many of your favourite household name artists will have been subject to horrific trauma, often from early childhood, often by virtue of the family bloodlines that they're born into. And this leads to systematic programming of the mind. It's derivatives of MK Ultra, this far-reaching mind control program coming out of the CIA, and there's a division of it which is very specific to the entertainment industry, known as monarch programming. And the exposure to this horrific trauma, particularly from early childhood, leads to the creation of different alters within the mind, different aspects of the personality, each of which can be programmed with its own identity. And these identities can be brought forth and put back into the confines of the mind at will through the use of trigger phrases and sometimes patterns and designs and symbols. And we find evidence of this throughout the music industry. And so it's my contention that Prince was subject to trauma-based mind control, and this would have been responsible for many of these alternative personalities. So he tended to fluctuate between a very effeminate, high-pitched vocal tone on many of his records and a very low, bass-heavy, very masculine tone. And this is indicative, again, of duality. And this is a theme that we find cropping up throughout Prince's canon of work. It was fascinatingly brought to the fore by a guy by the name of Dan Munro, who is from the UK. I first met him when I guested on the Planet X radio show in Liverpool many years ago. And Dan has since located to Australia at pretty much the worst time to be there, so bad timing. But Dan put together an amazing essay on Prince and of many of the themes and the symbolism present in his music and his imagery, which I published in Musical Truth Volume 2. So the main appendix to that book is his analysis of these different aspects to Prince. So he's drawing on this duality, and he's drawing on some of the themes that we see cropping up throughout Prince's work. And this can be demonstrated by going through some of his albums, volume by volume, and looking at some of the songs that we find there. So this is, just for a moment, thinking about this androgynous symbol which Prince used as his official artist name for a period in the 1990s, when he became known as the artist formerly known as Prince. He first asked to be known by this unpronounceable symbol, and this is an excerpt from the Vigilant Citizen website addressing this dynamic. The love symbol appeared on the cover to his 1993 album. Although Prince never fully explained the meaning of this symbol, other than it came to him during meditation, one can easily discern an amalgamation of the male and female symbols crossed by a trumpet-like instrument. It might be a visual representation of his androgynous musical persona. And then from the Illuminati Watcher website, the proprietor Isaac Weishaupt, not his real name, said this: there could be more behind the LGBT movement than just equal rights if you consider the beliefs of the secret history of the occult. They believe that humans were originally androgynous beings and someday will return to this perfected state. We know that there is an attempt at destroying the male-female paradigm in order to usher in the digital matrix hell through transhumanism. So maybe this was one form of early predictive programming sent to us from Warner Brothers under the guise of a staged rebellion from this famous musician. But when we talk about androgyny and a blurring of the genders, and also the concepts of duality, this brings to mind this entity known as Baphomet, so beloved of certain secret societies and ancient mystery schools. It's this figure which blends male and female characteristics. We've got the feminine energy of the moon contrasted with the male energy of the sun, and we've got different other aspects of duality expressed here. And this is a theme that we find throughout Prince's work. This is one of his early albums, titled Dirty Mind, which certainly sums up some of his early material. And then by the time we get to 1999, which was his fourth album, we've got some interesting symbolism which starts to creep into his sleeve designs. So we've got an obvious all-seeing eye going on. We've got all kinds of other esoteric and arcane symbology going on there. And if we do a mirror image reversal of this sleeve in line with the tenet of satanic inversion, we live, unfortunately, in a satanically inverted society where if you want to get to the truth of the matter or to what's being communicated, you have to take what you're being offered and flip it on its head 180 degrees in the opposite direction. And when we do that with this sleeve on 1999, we find a 666 appearing alongside a distinctly phallic-looking symbol. In the song 1999, Prince is talking about some kind of cataclysm, some kind of apocalypse which is going to occur. And he's talking about partying like it's 1999. One interesting thing about this is that the song came out in 1982, and the lyrical themes seem to be addressing what came to be known as the Millennium Bug. You might recall that as we got towards the end of the year 1999, there was all this talk about terrible things that were going to happen when the clocks ticked over in electronic equipment from 99 to 00. So there would be no value in those fields, and therefore this equipment, whether it's aircraft or computers, would malfunction, and there would be absolute chaos, planes falling from the skies and all kinds of other madness. Well, the rest of the world caught on to this in 1999, but Prince was addressing it 18 years before the event in the lyrical content of this song. So we have to ask ourselves whether he moved in such circles as to be clued in advance as to what was going to be coming. And he's talking in this song about a necessary cataclysm befalling humanity. And in many of his other songs, he talks about a new dawn, or possibly a golden dawn, arising as a result of this calamity which humanity must undergo. It's a recurring theme throughout his songs. On this album, which was the first one to feature his backing group, The Revolution, it's the first time you see Prince and The Revolution credited, you've got this phrase which crops up in the sleeve notes, "May you live to see the dawn." And this cropped up on several subsequent album sleeves. The album for which Prince is arguably best known would be Purple Rain, released in 1984. This was also a movie of the same name, and the title track from the album was released as a single. On this album, there was a very controversial track called Darling Nikki. And this was typical of Prince's material by this point in his career. It was sexually explicit, and it was lewd and lascivious. It was the type of content for which Prince was best known. Dan Munro, though, in his essay, points out that every time you find a track of this nature on one of Prince's albums, there's another track which will be very reflective, very spiritual, displaying great esoteric knowledge to kind of balance out the lewd and lascivious and sexually promiscuous stuff. So it's almost as if Prince is seeking to redeem himself, to emancipate himself from the sin that he's committed through these other tracks by becoming spiritual and reflective and exploring all these religious themes elsewhere on the same albums. It's another expression of duality, of polarities. So this track, Darling Nikki, saw to it that the introduction of the phrase parental advisory got introduced to albums at that stage in the 1980s. So we're probably all familiar with output that carries a sticker of that nature. It was Tipper Gore, the wife of the politician and career liar Al Gore, who saw to it that parental advisory stickers were introduced. Reportedly, she walked in on their 11-year-old daughter listening to this track, Darling Nikki, and was pretty horrified with what her daughter was being exposed to. So she began that campaign. Now, the interesting thing about Darling Nikki is that although on the face of it, it's sexually explicit, there is, at the end of it, a backmasked message. This is going into the concept of backmasked recordings. And it was a phenomenon which was exploited by groups such as the Beatles, who did it knowingly. They placed subliminal messages into their music, such as in the Run Out Groove to Strawberry Fields Forever, which is supposed to contain a clue pertaining to the replacement of Paul McCartney. And also it occurred at the hands of groups like Led Zeppelin, where I would suggest these messages were finding their way in there without the conscious knowledge of the music makers. There was some other force causing this to happen. So when it comes to this track, Darling Nikki, it's obviously a deliberate backmasked message. And when we listen to it, this is what it sounds like. So you got the sound of wind and rain as if some storm or possibly some catastrophe, picking up on that earlier theme. And then you hear Prince saying, "Hello, how are you? I'm fine because I know that the Lord is coming soon, coming soon." So it's these religious, spiritual ideas juxtaposed with these ideas of catastrophe and calamity. The next album, following on from Purple Rain, was 1985's Around the World in a Day. There was an incredible track on this titled The Ladder. And here, Prince is exploring this phenomenon of the internal alchemical process, or what's been termed, in some quarters, the raising of the chrism oil. This is a variation on Kundalini energy, and it's this portal to higher levels of consciousness which occurs when the pineal gland is illuminated as a part of this process. So the ladder is a metaphorical addressing of this internal process of the rising of Kundalini energy or the chrism oil up through the spinal column up into the brain, where this brain chemistry occurs and the pineal gland gets illuminated. So this is incredible esoteric knowledge at the hands of a musician, which again suggests he moved in circles where he had access to this kind of information. He's looking for the ladder. Everyone wants salvation of the soul. The steps you take are no easy road, but the reward is great for those who want to go. By 1987, Prince had put out this album, Blink and You Miss It, literally. It was called The Black Album. Appears to have been modelled on the Beatles' The White Album. And this was very promptly withdrawn from circulation. So it was put out there a few months after his album Sign of the Times. And at Prince's request, this album was withdrawn from the shops very quickly, and it didn't see the light of day again for another 7 years. Warner Brothers, his label, eventually released it in 1994. So we have to ask ourselves what could have caused this album to have been withdrawn from circulation, in largely the same way as that Beatles album that we saw earlier, Yesterday and Today. Well, there is a track on the Black Album called Cindy C, and it's said to be all about the supermodel Cindy Crawford, who was big news in the 1980s. But the lyric goes, "Cindy C, play with me, I will pay the usual fee." So there's hints of prostitution or trafficking going on there. "I'll give you 7 sips of elderberry wine. Maybe we'll unlock the secrets of your mind." So the reference to unlocking the secrets of your mind Makes me think of, again, mind control, these different alters, these different personalities, which could be unlocked by a handler who knows the trigger. But then we've got this reference to 7 sips of elderberry wine, which could be a reference to something altogether more disturbing, particularly for anyone who's researched the unsettling subject area of adrenochrome. Could this be a knowing reference on the part of Prince to adrenochrome in 1987? Then we have another track from that same album where we have the lyrics, "If your body needs water, keep on dancing because you oughta. Keep the blood flowing down to your feet. Brother Morris will be round in a minute with a bucket filled in it, squirrel meat. The blood real good if you drink it real fast, but the aftertaste just lasts and lasts." So where we have Prince putting out songs which appear to be him seeking redemption or emancipation from things that he's addressed in other songs, could this be the ultimate that he's seeking to redeem himself from? Knowledge of the adrenochrome agenda. We have the 1988 album Love Sexy. The title of Dan Munro's piece was Spooky Electric to Love Sexy. And on this album, we've got Prince embodying 2 personas, again, consistent with ideas of mind control. So Spooky Electric is embodying evil and darkness, whereas Love Sexy is all about the light and love. And you have these 2 entities with Prince stepping into both roles in performance mode, going up against each other. There's a lyric from that album which goes, "I know there is a heaven, I know there is a hell. Listen to me, people, I've got a story to tell. I know there was confusion, lightning all around me. That's when I called his name. Don't you know he found me? No is what Spooky Electric say. It's not okay. But I know love is the only way, till my dying day. No, till my dying day, I'll be okay, because Love Sexy is the one till my day is done." So we move on now to very strange aspects surrounding Prince's death, or what we were told about it. So 2016 was a very unfortunate year for rock musicians. David Bowie is said to have died in January of that year, and at the very end of the year, George Michael is said to have turned up dead in bed on Christmas Day at the age of 53, you know, like you do. And then somewhere between those two, with a whole load of other musicians checking out in 2016 as well, including Rick Parfitt of Status Quo, we had Prince on the 21st of April 2016 turning up dead in an elevator, so we're told, at the age of 57 at his Paisley Park complex just outside Minneapolis. So this is Paisley Park. This was Prince's business headquarters. He had a recording studio here, and he also had living quarters here. You've got that familiar symbol outside the building, and you'll note that at the entrance to it, you've got a pyramid with a capstone, and this pyramid would reportedly glow purple to show that Prince was in the building. So he turns up dead in an elevator. Prince had a song called Let's Go Crazy on his Purple Rain album, where he says, "We ain't gonna let the elevator bring us down." And there was a story which emerged when Prince's death was announced, coming from L.A. Reid, who was part of L.A. and Babyface, this music act, and he was also a music industry executive and a friend of Prince. And L.A. Reid went on an interview and he says, Prince thought elevators were the devil and finds his friend's death haunting. But in the song, what Prince appears to be saying is, we ain't gonna let de-elevator, not the. So a de-elevator is something that takes you down rather than up. So the symbology involves being brought down to base consciousness in this heavy, dense 3D reality, rather than being elevated to higher aspects of consciousness. It's another recurring theme throughout Prince's work. And so when he talks about de-elevator, de-elevation being the devil, he's talking about base consciousness being rooted in that sort of experience. So here's the song. Are we going to let de-elevator bring us down? Oh no, let's go crazy. Doctor, everything will be all right, we'll make everything go wrong. Pills and thrills and daffodils will kill. Hang tough, children. So Prince is said to have died from an overdose of fentanyl, courtesy of Big Pharma. And here he is saying, pills will kill. Interesting. So here she is. This is another recurring theme, isn't it? In this one. Yeah, throw the eggs and tomatoes this way, please. So, the Queen's birthday is the 21st of April. And in 2016, the world was being asked to celebrate Her Travesty's 90th birthday. And as part of this event, various monuments around the world were being illuminated in purple, a colour traditionally associated with royalty, including Niagara Falls on the US-Canada border. So right at the time that all this is going on, Prince, an artist heavily associated with the colour purple, just happens to turn up dead. A prince dies while a queen's life is being celebrated. Plenty of symbolism there. And there's more on Niagara Falls. So, by way of coincidence, it was here that the singer Denise Matthews, better known by her stage name of Vanity, went on to become a protege and reportedly a love interest of Prince, and her public image was closely associated with it. Vanity died 2 months before Prince at the age of 57, reportedly of a liver failure resulting from years of drug abuse. The plot thickens when you learn that Vanity's date of death was exactly the same as that of Prince's mother 14 years earlier, 15th of February, and that Prince's father died on the exact same day as Aaliyah, the R&B singer, on the 25th of August 2001. This was 17 days before the events of 9/11, and 17 days was the title of the song which appeared as the B-side to Prince's When Doves Cry. You have to wonder whether this amount of synchronicities or synchromysticism is possible at the hands of human planning. Is it possible for a group of people to sit down at a table and devise all this stuff, or is this only possible at the hands of certain other forces of nature? We then have the title of this single, also released from the Purple Rain album, to consider. So Prince was very fond of substituting numerical figures for letters. So he would often express the word for as the figure 4, and the letter U for the word you. So if we apply a numerical value to the letter U, we find that it's the 21st letter of the alphabet. So then I would die for you becomes I would die for 21, or I would die the 4th month of the year, April, 21st day, 21. I would die 21st April, the exact date on which we're told Prince died. This song, although it was released in 1984, we find out from this information, was recorded on the 3rd of August 1983. So this was 33 years in that Masonic tradition before we're told Prince checked out in 2016.
You finally did it!
Oops. No, it is meant to happen. I was just meant to introduce it. So, thinking about the phenomenon of predictive programming, which is where aspects of events which are known to be coming are encoded into works of popular culture. So it could be music videos, it could be TV shows, it could be movies, it could be cartoons. And it gets the public consciousness familiar with something that they're going to be asked to accept in future years. And sometimes the predictive programming happens years or even decades before the event in question. So when it comes to the death of Prince, there was a depiction of this in an episode of The Simpsons. So The Simpsons have previous when it comes to predictive programming. With pretty much every major world event, you could pinpoint an episode of The Simpsons where seemingly they knew it was coming. And so it is with the death of Prince, as we find from this excerpt.
You finally did it! You mixed Buzz Cola with the smooth, rich taste of lemon.
Unfortunately, there are certain stars who won't do what we want.
What's their problem?
They're still alive.
And then we thought, who's good at killing celebrities?
Me!
That's right! Homer, would you be willing to acquire some more, accounts for us?
Well, you know, it is awfully hot today. No, I'm too cold.
Psycho killer, qu'est-ce que c'est? Psycho killer, qu'est-ce que c'est?
So there it is. If it's in The Simpsons, it must be true. So, was there any kind of motive for Prince being taken out by those who had facilitated his career? Well, it turns out there are plenty of potential motives if that's what we're dealing with here. So Prince became very outspoken about the nature of the music business and the way that record labels treat their artists. He had a lot to say about the restrictive nature of his contract with Warner Brothers, and he sought to win back some artistic autonomy for himself in terms of gaining back control of his own recordings and master tapes and publishing. So here's one quote that he made publicly: "The first step I've taken towards the ultimate goal of emancipation from the chains that bind me to Warner Brothers was to change my name from Prince to the love symbol. Prince is the name that my mother gave me at birth. Warner Brothers took the name, trademarked it, and used it as the main marketing tool to promote all of the music that I wrote. The company owns the name Prince and all related music marketed under Prince. I became merely a pawn used to produce more money for Warner Brothers." As well as becoming critical of the true nature of the music business, Prince also had a few comments to make about other things that go on in society, of the nature that mainstream artists aren't really supposed to talk about, unless it's all part of the script. So he appeared in 2009 on a chat show hosted by Tavis Smiley, where he started talking about some stuff that he'd learnt from Dick Gregory, who was a comedian and political activist going back all the way to the 1960s. And Prince talked about learning about the phenomenon of chemtrails, geoengineering, from Dick Gregory, along with a whole load of other stuff. So let's take a look at the excerpt from this interview.
When I saw the State of the Black Union, Dick Gregory really moved me and a lot of my friends. I showed it to everybody that comes over the house, especially white folks, because they need to hear that, you know, so that they know more about all of us. Because what he said affects all of us. He said something that really hit home about this phenomena of chemtrails. And, you know, when I was a kid, I used to see these trails in the sky all the time. And so, oh, that's cool. A jet just went over. And then you started to see a whole bunch of them. And the next thing you know, everybody in your neighborhood was fighting and arguing and you didn't know why. Okay, and you really didn't know why. I mean, everybody was fighting. So he started riffing about the chemtrails. And he started to say things that hit home so hard. And I would recommend that everybody try to get what he said online or wherever and try to get a copy of it and just listen to it. Because I was so moved that I had to write the song. The other thing is the first line of the song says I was born on the same plantation in the United States of the red, white, and blue. And we live in a place now that feels just about like a plantation. We're all indentured servants. You know, when I found out there were 8 presidents before George Washington, I wanted to smack somebody. You know, I wanted to know why I was taught otherwise. Just tell me the whole story. I'll fill in the blanks, but don't, you know, don't tell me something that you think I'm supposed to know.
Dick Gregory was involved in the counterculture of the 1960s. So there was an event which really kick-started that whole flower power scene. In San Francisco's Golden Gate Park, it was called the Human Being in January of '67. So you see Dick Gregory on the bill for that. A few years later, he cropped up on TV in 1975. He's one of 2 individuals who first presented the Zapruder footage of the JFK assassination to the American public. So we're all familiar with that footage now, but nobody saw that until 1975. So from 1963 all the way through to 75, that was just unseen by anyone in the world. And Dick Gregory first presented that footage alongside Bob Grodin. So that's one of his other claims to fame. After Prince made these comments about all this stuff that he learnt from Dick Gregory, Gregory sought to distance himself from Prince. He said he didn't know him and he doesn't care for celebrities. Shortly after that, Dick Gregory went into hospital to be treated for a urine infection and he never came out again. He was 84, and admittedly 84-year-olds do die, but he was fully expected to make a recovery from that, but he never did. It's very reminiscent of the story with James Brown, which I presented in a separate presentation, where James Brown went into hospital and didn't come out again. The suspicion is that he was poisoned. This was on Christmas Day 2006. That was 10 years to the day before George Michael turned up dead in bed on Christmas Day of 2016. So back to Prince, he's just a world of contradictions and a world of duality. Once again, you know, in this TV interview, he's wearing black and white, so we've got more of that duality going on. And he was very fond of flashing these so-called Illuminati symbols. So he's doing the same triangle of manifestation that we saw Stuart Sutcliffe of the Beatles doing several decades before. And he's also got his hat tilted over one eye, so you've got the one eye evocation going on there as well. So was he a good guy? Was he a bad guy? Was he a little bit of both? Was he deeply entrenched in some very unsavoury stuff that goes on? Or was he trying to warn us in his own way? Or was his death in some way faked, as some suspect it was? So that is an excerpt from a concert which Prince performed in December of 1998 in Utrecht in the Netherlands. He ends the show by saying, "Got to get back to America, Osama bin Laden's getting ready to bomb." This was a little less than 3 years before the events of September 11th, 2001, which would be pinned on Osama bin Laden. He didn't do it, but the important thing is that people were asked to believe that he did. And then he adds to that by saying 2001 hit me. So this, again, would hint at advanced knowledge on the part of Prince as to what was going to be coming. He seems to have been clued in on the fact that something was going to happen in 2001 and Osama bin Laden was going to be blamed for it. So again, it raises the question of whether he was trying to warn us or whether he was knowingly complicit in the entire agenda. One last thing to leave you with. This is, again, from the Black album. This is from the Love Sexy album, Spooky Electric. Call People magazine, Rolling Stone, call your next of kin, because your ass is gone. He got a 57 mag with the price tag still on the side, cousin. Because when Spooky say dead, you better say died. He's got a 57 mag. What age was Prince when we're told he turned up dead in that elevator again? That would be 57. So obviously, a lot of the material that I presented this evening is very dark and devastating in nature. And inevitably, this style of research is going to lead to those kind of results. And joking aside, it does bring me no joy to have to reveal this kind of information about acts who are much loved by so many people. Everyone's got personal heroes, everyone's got role models, everyone's got public figures that they look up to. It's been that way with me. In my case, it was DJs for the most part. But the truth is the truth, and I don't think any of us would have ventured out this evening if we weren't interested in uncovering the truth about the music industry and all these other institutions, all these other expressions of organised society. And one very positive thing is simply the fact that we're now able to uncover information of this nature. And we can consider ourselves quite privileged in being the first generation that's been able to discover all this stuff. Because most of it has been the domain only of very exclusive secret society fraternities. And only those deemed worthy of this kind of knowledge, those sort of initiates, have been privy to this sort of information. But now anyone can research this stuff thanks to the abundance of information that's out there. And the cat is out of the bag and it's not going back in anytime soon. So once this information gets out, it's not going anywhere. There's only one direction things are going to move in. And we're finding this stuff out about so many different areas of our lives, not just how the music industry operates, but how the world of politics operates, the true nature of money, of finance, the true nature of, history and geopolitics, every other aspect of our lives. And I don't think it was the plan of those who consider themselves the rulers of organised society for the likes of us to gain access to this kind of information. So I see that as a very positive thing. And I see my personal role, my personal contribution to be bringing information of this nature to the table. This is my individual contribution. So I know a lot about this stuff. I don't know a lot about politics and finance and medicine and all the rest of it. But that's okay, because there's plenty of other experts and whistleblowers and insiders who do. And they're bringing their individual pieces of the puzzle to the table. And together, we can put all those individual pieces together and get the big picture of what's going on. That process is well underway, and it's only going to continue. And so we can draw great positivity from the fact that it's all moving in that direction. And as long as we continue to do whatever we can to keep that process moving forward, we're soon going to expose all this darkness and all these lies and all these deceptions that have had such a hold over us all throughout our lives, to the point that the mind control and the trickery and the propaganda is never again going to work. That's a very positive thing in my view. Thanks for listening. Thanks a lot, folks.